the third man, of course, Anton Karas. Hi, everybody. This is Randy Credico. Randy Credico live on the fly. This is not an Assange special today. We're doing a special on the Nicaraguan elections, what's going on there, what has gone on there, what has gone on throughout the region over the last 100 years with someone who really knows, and that is Stephen Kinzer, who was the correspondent for the New York Times back then in Nicaragua when I was there in the 80s, along with Chris Hedges. And he moved on to Berlin, and he's written a bunch of books, starting out with Bitter Fruit. She gave me a copy of in Nicaragua, in Managua, in 1986. So Stephen Kinzer, look him up. If you don't know who he is, you better. But you're going to hear a very fascinating interview with him. We're going to play some Sandinista music by the Godoy brothers, and we'll be right back with Stephen Kinzer.
Compadre, guarda barranco, hermano de viento, de canto y de luz. Decime si en tus andanzas viste una chavala llamada Arlenciú.
Yo vi descensontre amigo, una estrella dulce en el cañaveral, saeta de mil colores, entre los rumores del pajonal.
Okay, that was Carlos Mejia Godoy. I don't know what tune it was, but it was Carlos Mejia Godoy. And I'm playing him today because we're going to talk about Nicaragua and the recent elections and what's going on there, try to clear things up with Stephen Kinzer, who I talked about in the preamble. He's the author of a bunch of books. I got him right here on my makeshift backdrop, all the bestseller, All the Shah's Men, Bitter Fruit, which he gave me in Nicaragua in 1986 in Managua over a glass of bourbon. And then you got The Brothers, you've got Overthrow, and then 1,000 Hills. The only one I haven't read, Steve, I'll be honest. All right?
Well, you'd like to think there's some good experiences left for you in life.
Yeah, well, that's going to be one of them. As one of them is, the other one is sitting in front of a fireplace with my 16-year-old dog. But I should be.
Thanks for putting me in that category.
No, that's where I read. I read right there in front of that fireplace, and I'm reading it's going to come right after I finish this bio on Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, I promise.
Well, you're missing the one book that refers to the subject to which you referred, and that is Blood of Brothers, which is the book that I wrote about my years in Nicaragua and the time that you were there as well.
I didn't have enough room. I know about Blood of Brothers.
Very good.
Enough room. I had to put Frida on here, and I had to put the great Pancho Villa. I think maybe it's Zapata, but so we are talking with Stephen Kinzer, a little frolicking there up front, but it's okay. We kind of free form this, and I didn't say you're award-winning, best-selling historian. You've done so much. You received so much attention for your work as a war correspondent. And that's when I met you in Nicaragua. I mean, I know it's a foreign correspondent, but you really were a war correspondent down there because it was in times of war, right? You were in the
I didn't start out to be a war correspondent. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, but I wound up covering the whole series of Central American wars. When I finally got out of Central America, they sent me to Germany, and I thought, this is great. It's the end of communism. I'm going to be sitting in salons with sophisticated intellectuals discussing the future of Europe. It didn't take more than a year before I was back in the mud in Yugoslavia and people shooting at me again. So the Central American experience really served me well in my war correspondent career.
Chris Hedges was talking about that. He's a big admirer of yours. You both worked for the Times. I think he did back then as well. But we were talking the other day at some event for Assange, and he was, I think he kind of followed your path. He went to Yugoslavia as well. I went from Nicaragua to Yugoslavia.
Not only that, Chris Hedges was my next door neighbor in Managua. So we've shared quite a few experiences ducking bullets together. And, Marines and soldiers tell you when you're in a foxhole together, it's really bonding. It's also bonding to be in a foxhole together when you're journalists and people are shooting over your head. So even though it's been a while since that happened, I think when people like Hedges and I and you get together and think about those days, we can agree that, as Bottom said in Midsummer Night's Dream, I have had a dream past the wit of man to say what dream it was.
Wow. Wow. I'm gonna have that's a movie with Mickey Rooney. I know it's Shakespeare, but Mickey
You're right.
Rooney-
I think it was Mickey Rooney that wrote that improvisation.
Right. No, but he was in the movie
You're
version.
right. He absolutely was.
He
Very
played Huck.
good.
I think
Good
he
for
played
you.
Huck, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Yes.
reason why I bring that up is I worked with him in Las Vegas for 6 months back in right after the Sandinistas lost the elections in 1990. I was at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas working with Mickey Rooney. He had no idea who the Sandinistas were.
So you went from the Sandinistas to the Sands. I like it.
The Sands, right in the Copa room, no less, where Frank and Sammy and Dean and Joey all worked. What a great room. But it was really weird because I was there on the 25th of January, and I had just gone from it was the 10-year anniversary, July of '89, and then all of this stuff happened. The Sandinistas lose to Uno on 20, whatever it was. They were Uno, right? And I was kind of crestfallen because I was such I was so smitten with the Sandinistas, and it kind of carries over today. I was there in 2010, 2011, 2009, and I wanted to believe what I believed back then. And back then, I was very hopeful. It was still in its infant stage, but it isn't the same, and it's difficult to admit that it's not the same. I was pulled over every 5 miles by these cops on the road to what's the name of that San Juan del Sur for no reason. So what's changed?
Well, you're absolutely right that the Sandinista movement that excited such international enthusiasm during the 1980s has completely transformed and lost just about everything that made it so appealing back in those days. So you're right. In 1990, the Sandinistas held an open election in Nicaragua and they lost. This could have been a great opportunity for them. And in fact, only a few years later, there was a clash within the Sandinista front. A group of people led by the vice president, Sergio Ramirez, the leading female guerrilla, Dora Maria Tellez, and a few others, set out to challenge the old leadership of the Sandinista front led by Daniel Ortega. So in 1995, there was a big convention and these forces met. The insurgents wanted to change the Sandinista front from a political military organization to a normal political party, more or less like a European social democratic party. And one of their insistent platform planks was, we renounce the use of violence in politics. This was not acceptable to the old group. There was a clash and the insurgents lost. They went off and founded their own group called the Sandinista Renovation Party or movement. It kind of faded away, transformed itself into something else over later years. But what had been the Sandinista front then remained under the control of Daniel Ortega, who turned it into a personal vehicle. Almost all of the best people in the Sandinista front quit, particularly during the 1990s. And slowly began to turn against Ortega. Meanwhile, Ortega, after losing a couple of elections, worked out a corrupt political system that would allow him to win the presidency with only 35% of the vote, which happened. Now he's been in power for 16 years. He's named his wife as co-president, which doesn't exist, but she's also his vice president. He obviously has the idea of trying to pass on the leadership of Nicaragua either to her or to one of his sons. So we have this really odd situation. The Sandinistas came to power by destroying the old Somoza dynasty, which was one family that insisted on ruling for decade after decade. And now, what do we have in Nicaragua but Back to the Future? We've got another family dictatorship, completely non-ideological, dedicated only to its own personal preservation. which is not only dedicated to remaining in office, not only until the president dies, but afterwards, but has also sought to consolidate itself with acts of breathtaking violence. There were protests in Nicaragua in 2018. More than 300 people were shot dead by police and thugs wearing ski masks working for Daniel Ortega. It was the bloodiest outburst of state repression in Latin America in the whole 21st century. Nothing like this had ever happened in Nicaragua before. Then, as the presidential election scheduled for this month approached, over the summer, Ortega had all the people who announced they wanted to run for president arrested, and they're all sitting in jail now. So those of us who lived in Nicaragua, who even knew Daniel Ortega, who had great hopes for Nicaragua, are in real shock now. We can't believe this happened. How can it be that all the best people in Nicaragua are in jail and this thug and his wife have taken over the country without any real prospect of escape? So we sit in this very sobering situation where a country that we love has fallen under a horribly repressive regime that is certainly the most brutal now ruling anywhere in Latin America. How did this happen? We're still trying to process this.
So, I mean, there have been some major change. There are people, you mentioned Sergio Ramirez, who is now in exile in Spain, I believe, tell him who Sergio Ramirez is. I was at a funeral with him. He did the eulogy for 3 Germans, if you remember, who were killed by the Contras in 1987 or 1988, just after Ben Linder. I was there with him, and he was a novelist. I think their #1 novelist at the time, and a soft-spoken guy, but he's now in exile for criticizing Daniel Ortega.
I give you another example. During the 1980s, there were great conflicts at the United Nations as Nicaragua was constantly presenting evidence that the United States was funding these Contra rebels to come in and kill people inside Nicaragua. The Sandinista ambassador to the United Nations was Victor Hugo Tinoco. He was vivid. He was denouncing Reagan and the Contras every day in a really sophisticated way and organized support for the Sandinistas through the United Nations in very effectively. Victor Hugo Tinoco is in jail now because he became an anti-Ortega figure. And Ortega, even though this guy is now, both of them are over 70, he felt like he needed to throw this person in jail. So you've got a very closed political system suddenly, and Nicaraguans desperately looking around for some escape.
Well, and then he's attacked, or she's had to leave the country, Gioconda Belli. I think they're moving to Spain, and he smeared speaking of 90-year-olds, Ernesto Cardenal. Ernesto Cardenal, who criticized the government, and he comes off on strong against Ernesto Cardenal, who really was an inspiration. I remember the Olaf Palme Center where he dedicated it. I went there and I saw performances. This was a great man and a key figure who was excoriated by Pope John Paul back in, I think, 1979 on the tarmac, along with Miguel de Escoto, if you recall.
Well, you're absolutely right that the old Sandinistas are not Sandinistas anymore. In fact, they resent the fact that Daniel Ortega calls himself Sandinista because the ideals that were supposed to undergird the Sandinista movement have nothing to do with what Ortega is doing now. So it's an awful situation, and probably the most challenging and horrific and complex in all of Latin America.
Right. Well, and then you have others who have left the party. We haven't mentioned a lot of my friends that worked there in the government. I remember in '86 in Esteli, '87 in Matagapa, and there was still a lot of hope down. As a journalist, you had to be dispassionate about it. You had to be, but even all the journalists, people that, Joe Gannon, who was there, John Lantigua, who was there, I knew that there was some kind of feeling that was supportive underneath it all for the Sandinistas, in spite of being an objective journalist. There was something about it that was so much different than Guatemala, Honduras at the time. Am I correct?
There certainly was a realization on the part of the press corps that since the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, there had never been an episode anywhere in the world that attracted so much international support. It wasn't just the Sandinistas, but it was Reagan's bizarre, obsessive response to the Sandinistas, unleashing a Contra war against them that led to this tremendous global movement of sympathy for the Sandinistas. As we were there as journalists, we watched these people show up from all over the world to try to support the Sandinistas in their defense against Reagan's Contra war. This naturally left a residue of admiration for the Sandinistas as valiant victims of imperial aggression. But it's important to realize that a lot has happened to that word Sandinista between then and now.
Right. It's like, the Republican Party today is not the Republican Party of Lincoln. They keep using that. The Sandinista Party today is not the Sandinista Party of the 70s. And it's not something that Sandino would approve. I think Sandino would be up in the hills right now fighting not just the Sandinista or Ortega, but of course against whatever designs the U.S. has. And I think the U.S. is probably looking to exploit this, not that they're supporting free elections there. I think that they got a way to get in there, and I don't think that their motives are so good, and they're not going to be able to give us what we would like to see down there. That's not in design.
First of all, it's interesting you mentioned Sandino, the great Nicaraguan revolutionary of the 1920s and 30s. One thing has really changed between the Sandino era and even the Sandinista revolution era of the 1970s and today. And it's this: Nicaraguans today agree that violent revolution is a terrible idea. They know because they did it themselves. When you violently overthrow a government, the government comes into the hands of people who believe in violence because that's how they came to power. And that leads to the kinds of troubles that Nicaragua is in now. So if there's one thing that unites all the disparate parts of the Nicaraguan opposition now, it's the conviction that rebelling with weapons is not an option. That's only going to produce another piece of the same cycle. So we have to find some other way. We're not going to rebel with arms. We need to produce a movement that is a generator of leaders who believe in civic action and political action, not violent action. How do you do that? How do you overthrow, undermine, subvert, or depose a regime that rules by brutal force if you yourself refuse to use force? This is the challenge that Nicaraguans are facing now, and it's really a big one. The other thing you mentioned had to do with the United States. So naturally, there are people in the US who always hated Ortega. They hated the Sandinistas back then. And they're the same ones that still want to overthrow Fidel Castro. They want to overthrow the Sandinistas of the 1980s. They're still in that mindset. So the Nicaraguan opposition is in great pain now, this suffering. Essentially, Ortega has succeeded in completely decapitating civil society and putting all the best people in the country in prison. So the opposition is suffering, and they want Ortega to suffer too. They want him to feel some of the pain that they're suffering. And that's a very normal response. So how do you do that? Well, we could get the US to impose sanctions. That's the normal kind of default idea. And we just did. So just in the last 2 weeks, there's been a new act passed called the Renacer Act that authorizes all kinds of new sanctions on Nicaragua. I'm very sympathetic to the desire of the opposition to try to change the situation through all kinds of pressure. But these sanctions actually don't have a concrete goal. They're just like the sanctions we impose on Iran and Cuba and Venezuela. Its idea is just pile on some more sanctions, make life more miserable, and then maybe things will happen, people will be unhappy, and they'll somehow rise up. academic studies have showed repeatedly, this doesn't work.
Right.
Making people suffer and then hoping they'll rise up, it never works. So I'm
And then
not
he
against the
consolidates his power. He uses that
Exactly.
as a reason. Yeah.
So I don't, if sanctions are part of a big diplomatic effort that includes carrots and sticks, there's ways to get rid of the sanctions. Each sanction is aimed to achieve a particular goal. That's one thing, but that's not where we are now. It's just sanction everybody, hate everybody, tell them you can't come to Disneyland anymore. We're blocking your accounts in the United States, and that will make us feel good. This is the principal goal of sanctions, to make the people who impose them feel good. They don't actually have an effect. So I can see, I sympathize with the Nicaraguan opposition that's trying to do something, but these sanctions actually have no practical negative effect on Ortega and his clique, and may ultimately wind up impoverishing Nicaraguans. So unless there's a more global strategy, I don't see this as working. And I'd also add one other thing that I know the anti-Ortega forces don't like to hear. There's at least a 20 or 30% group in Nicaragua that really supports Ortega. And those are the people that want to use violence. You cannot have a political system that crushes them or seeks to destroy them. That's what the opposition wants. We have to have a complete, what they call in Spanish, borrón y cuento nuevo. Everything is gone, we start all over again. And we don't want anybody ever associated with Ortega ever to be back in politics or government again. That's only going to start the same cycle again. The new system somehow has to offer a place for people across the political spectrum, and that's something that Nicaragua has never been able to achieve.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here. Please don't go away. You got some time there. Here in New York City, we're gonna go out, but we're gonna come back and continue this discussion with author, war correspondent, academic, professor at Brown, Steve Kinzer, and in just a minute. Here's Nicaragua, Nicarita, and we'll be right back with Stephen Kinzer.
Nicaragua, Nicaragüita. Este es el pueblo de Nicaragua, la flor más linda de mi querer. Abonada con la bendita Nicaragüita, sangre de Diriángel. Ay, Nicaragua, sos más dulcita. Creciéndose. Que la pielita de Tamagá. Pero ahora que ya sos libre, Nicaragüita, yo te quiero mucho más. Pero ahora que ya sos libre, Nicaragüita, yo te quiero mucho más. Que oiga el imperialismo. Ay, Nicaragua, Nicaragua.
Okay, we are back here. I'm Randy Credico Live on the Fly. We are talking with Steve Kinzer. Steve, so picking up where you left off, there's no way to dislodge this organization that runs it, this hardcore. Are you saying that he's only got 25% when he got 75% of the election returns when his way? That's as high as Trujillo got in 1960.
But it's not as high as Diem got in Vietnam when he had his referendum in 1956. Diem told the CIA officer, Ed Lansdale, who was operating the Vietnam Project in those days, that he needed to have over 90%. Lansdale said that doesn't work in America. You got to go in the 60s, like 64, 68% would be good. Diem said, no, it has to be 98.
Right.
So Ortega actually had an interesting calculation for this election, and I'm not sure I fully understand it. He decided he had to arrest all the other aspirants and put them all in jail. So yeah, he got 70% of the votes. There were no other real opposition candidates except for a few who were paid to participate, and turnout was very low. Nonetheless, we now find ourselves in a situation where voting is not an option for a solution to this problem. what is the solution? This is the real dilemma that Nicaraguans are facing now. They don't want another violent revolution, but they're facing a terribly oppressive situation. The United States really has no moral authority in Nicaragua. We've spent more than 100 years grotesquely deforming the politics of Nicaragua. For us to show up now and tell the Nicaraguans that we have a solution for you is something that many Nicaraguans will reject, and I think many people around the world would as well. So I have this deep sympathy for my Nicaraguan friends. They have a real challenge to deal with, but there has to be a new kind of politics that allows a certain amount of inclusion rather than a continuation of this rural concept of power where you kill me or I kill you. And in fact, you know, the more I've now watched what's happening in the United States in the last couple of years, I've come to realize that places like Nicaragua actually taught me a lot of lessons, because this is what happens in democracies. We're not that far away from that in the United States. And the idea that you have a deeply divided population in a country that's awash with guns is a little bit frightening. 200 years of democratic tradition or 250 years is not a lot. And let me tell you, the way that the United States was formed is a form of government that is not natural. The natural way of people is to seek harsh leaders. If you want to preserve this system, it takes a lot of work. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in the situation that Nicaragua's in, and we're not so far away from it.
I agree with that. I think with the divisions right now, and you are right. It seems like those who I would describe as reactionary, they want it more. And the other side doesn't seem to want it as much as the one side that is more reactionary. It's like Franco; he wanted it more maybe than the Spanish government, the Republic. In other countries, they want it more. Hitler, he wanted it more than the Social Democrats.
I put it a little bit differently. I think there's a Leninist principle that whenever you have groups of organizations competing for power, and there's one group that's willing to kill its enemies, and the others are not willing, don't want to kill anybody, the one that wants to kill its enemies is going to wind up on top. This is a very cruel rule of history, but the fact is, it's like what the Vikings used to say: what you cannot hold is not yours. The strong do what they can, and the poor suffer what they must. These are the cruel rules of history, and Nicaragua is trying to find a way around them.
Well, let me. I want to talk more about Che, but just you said it's the most repressive government in Latin America. What about Honduras? I mean, we don't hear about Honduras. We don't hear about Guatemala. I certainly wouldn't want to live in those countries right now. I mean, I don't know if those are democratic countries, and maybe people are too passive to resist it. You don't hear about the government repression there, but I'm sure it exists. Zelaya was overthrown. What is it like there? Have you visited? Are you heard much about the countries around El Salvador?
Oh, I'm totally immersed in this. At the moment we're speaking, I'm teaching a class at Brown called Roots of Crisis in Central America. So I just had one of the members of the Sandinista National Directorate from the 1980s on our Zoom screen just the day before yesterday.
Who was that?
Talking about that was Luis Carrion.
Oh, really?
So I'm totally immersed in this. Interestingly, you talk about the other countries in the region, therefore. So Guatemala, Honduras. Guatemala is a mafia state. Honduras is a drug gang state. The president of Honduras has been named in documents submitted in court in the Southern District of New York as a major international cocaine trafficker. His brother has been convicted and was just sentenced to 25 years in prison in New York. In his indictment, it always talks about he has a close relative who has a high position in Honduras. The U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York has an indictment ready to go for the president of Honduras as soon as he leaves office, which is supposed to be later this year, very soon. The day he's out of office, he's going to be indicted as a major drug trafficker. In the meantime, he's our ally. we support him. We send money to his police, who are totally corrupt and dedicating to going out and supporting people who kill environmental activists. The drug gangs in Honduras have not only penetrated the state, they are the state. But yet, it's a government that we embrace, that we support. It's the successor government to the coup government that took over in 2009 with the applause of Hillary Clinton and various members of Congress. So actually, just last week, this drug dealing president of Honduras showed up in, of all places, Nicaragua. There he was photographed with Daniel Ortega. I began to think, wait a minute, there's two former presidents of Honduras, Sanchez Serén and Funes, who have been accused of corruption in El Salvador, and they've gotten refuge in Nicaragua. And Ortega even gave them citizenship, so they can't be extradited. I have a feeling that Juan Orlando Hernandez, the drug dealing president of Honduras, was in Nicaragua last week to arrange for a visit. I'm going to stay here. After I'm out of office, if I'm indicted, I'm coming to Nicaragua. I'm going to be a citizen like those two Salvadoran presidents. Maybe we can have a big finca together, the ex-presidents. So that's Honduras. That's our ally. One of the most dangerous places in the world to be an environmental activist or a protester. We love them. Guatemala, also drug-oriented, but mafia completely. The state has been totally taken over by mafia groups, and the government has expelled the United Nations Commission, which was aimed at trying to find out criminality in the Guatemalan ruling class. We didn't protest against this. Why? Because the president of Guatemala is keeping refugees from going into Mexico, and he and the Honduran guy opened up embassies in Jerusalem. They moved their embassies like we wanted them to. So for these reasons, we embrace these corrupt leaders. So Joe Biden came into office, and when he talked about Central America, he said, I want to get to the root problems, which are corruption and violence and poverty. But actually, those are not the root problem. What caused corruption and poverty and violence? Actually, a lot of it was American policies. So if you look back, it's actually we who put those people in power, and we're still applauding them while we denounce Ortega. People in Central America and beyond can be forgiven for seeing a little hypocrisy there.
Right. You know, it goes way back. I read a book years ago that I just sent to John Pilger to read. I don't know if you remember this correspondent in Central America by the name of William Krim. He was a Canadian that went down and ended up not being able to come back. And he did this book, Democracies and Tyrannies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and wonderful anecdotes, whether it be Trujillo or Ubico in Honduras. I think that's where Ubico was. Thomas Martinez.
Ubico was in Guatemala, but you're close enough.
Thomas Hernandez Martinez, the Matanza in El Salvador, and so Somoza. So, I mean, this was back then. He only got 10% of his stuff published. So he decided to write a book on it. But, you know the history of Central America going way back. And so we've always seemed to embrace some of the worst people. I mean, and then someone like here, Bitter Fruit. Bitter Fruit was that had to be a bestseller. Everybody I know has read Bitter Fruit. And you've done a lot of study on, and that's the CIA. All right, we're talking about the CIA did that. You got the book on the brothers there. You got the book on overthrow here. And a lot of that stuff, overthrow, takes place in Latin America and Central America. Am I correct?
We've always believed that the Caribbean basin, meaning the Caribbean islands, Central America, the north coast of South America, is our backyard. And we've insisted that no government there can challenge American power. That's been a constant ever since the Roosevelt corollary, when Teddy Roosevelt was president. where he announced that the United States had arrogated to itself what he called an international police power to go and slap down regimes that we didn't like. This is what explains our 60-year-old obsession with Cuba. We can't believe that they rebelled against us and they managed to survive all this time. So we've always wanted to maintain control over that region. But one thing that I think you can say about our relations with the governments of that region of the Caribbean Basin, sometimes we've had great relations with those countries, like when Batista was in power in Cuba and Trujillo and Somoza. Also, other times we had terrible relations, like when Arbenz came to power in Guatemala, or when the Sandinistas were in power in the 1980s. But one thing you can say that's a constant is that US relations with countries in the Caribbean Basin have always been bad for the people who live there.
Right.
Whether we've hated their governments or loved their governments, it's always been bad for the ordinary people, and they have never been part of our calculation as we shape our policies for that part of the world.
Right. So get back to Guatemala. You know, you wrote this book, you spent time down there. It really is a tale of woe for, you know, going back before Arbenz. There was that one period, Arbenz and Arvelo, that was good. But before that and after that, it's been a nightmare.
Guatemala is the main country in Central America. As you may know, Central America became independent in 1821 as a one nation, not so long after the United States. It had 5 states: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. And only that federation only lasted a few decades. It split apart. Guatemala had always been the dominant country. It had been the seat of Spanish rule over Central America, had the first university, the biggest city, and so forth. So Guatemala has always been the dominant country in Central America, just as Mexico has always kind of dominated Central America itself. Guatemala, as you said, was ruled by a series of dictators through the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. Guatemala, because of its beautiful climate, is known as the land of the eternal spring. But that period from 1944 to 1954 is sometimes called the 10 years of spring in the country of eternal winter. And that's a political version of that meteorological phrase. So in 1944, a democratic government came to power in Guatemala. And it lasted for 10 years under 2 presidents, Arevalo and then Jacobo Arbenz. The United States could not tolerate this. The ultimate reason was that this government was promoting efforts that put the interests of Guatemalans ahead of the interests of American corporations. This was not acceptable to the United States. At that time, there was one giant American corporation that was totally dominant in Guatemala, and that was United Fruit Company. United Fruit not only owned most of the arable land, it owned the only railway network in the country, it owned the only electric system in the country, it owned the only port, so you couldn't export anything without United Fruit's permission, and you couldn't get to the port without going on United Fruit's tracks. So President Arbenz wanted to build a road to the coast and a port that anyone could use. And he wanted to take away land that United Fruit was not using. This was considered unacceptable, absolutely a challenge to American power that could not be tolerated. And in 1954, after 10 years of democracy in Guatemala, the CIA sponsored a coup that crushed that democracy and led Guatemala into dictatorship. It was one of a number of coups like the ones in Chile and the one in Iran that destroyed a relatively democratic government to put a dictatorship in power.
And that was
the reason for that was very clear. Under a dictatorship, the United States can set the rules. Only 6 years after the US coup in Guatemala in 1960, when it became clear that dictatorship was now the new system and there wasn't going to be any return to democracy, there was an uprising within the military. it was crushed, and the dissident military leaders went off into the field. That started a 30-year civil war. During those 30 years, more than 200,000 Guatemalans were slaughtered, almost all of them unarmed Mayan peasants. That was more people than were killed in all of Latin America combined during those years. Forget Chile, forget El Salvador, Argentina, everything. Guatemala was the real charnel house of the Americas. And that was set in motion by the American coup of 1954. We thought it was more important to protect the interests of United Fruit than to assure that Guatemala could maintain a level of social peace. Guatemala has never managed to escape from the culture of violence that emerged in part from the regimes that we imposed, that we had to impose to protect our interests as we saw them in the years after the 1954 coup. So the story of Guatemala is really tragic and leads many Guatemalans and others to wonder, how might that country have developed if we had just allowed democracy to unfold? Arbenz was coming to the end of his term. In 2 years, there was going to be another election. All the other candidates were more pro-American than Arbenz was. But we couldn't wait. We didn't want another regime that would be a little bit sympathetic to democracy. We wanted one that was 100% the faithful servant of United Fruit. That's what we got. And 200,000 dead people in a genocide over 30 years is what Guatemala got.
Well, I find this book so fascinating, how you tell the story of how it transpired, because there really wasn't U.S. troops there. There wasn't much of a contra force, if you will. There was this guy, Arias, I think his name was. Was that his name? The guy who led
Castillo Armas. Yeah.
Armas, yes, Armas. I'm sorry. And then you had the sound effects of aerial bombing, I think, coming out of the U.S. Embassy. So it was almost like a stage production type of rebellion. It wasn't.
You're absolutely right. The Operation Guatemala was not a real invasion. It was a psychological war. And the reason that we were able to overthrow Arbenz so easily is that Arbenz was not the kind of person we said he was. If he had been a brutal dictator, as we said, it wouldn't have been possible to penetrate Guatemala the way we did, to bribe military officers, to penetrate student groups, trade unions, newspapers, and turn them all to CIA purposes. So I'll tell you a little story that came out of this. So much history emerged from that Guatemala coup of 1954. During the Arbenz period, when land reform was taking hold in Guatemala, people in Latin America were fascinated. They loved this idea. And young idealists and reformists from all over Latin America came to Guatemala. They wanted to watch the process of democracy unfolding. When the coup took place, those people had to flee. And many of them ultimately, they went to the Mexican embassy and they were ultimately allowed to go to Mexico. One of those young idealists who showed up in Guatemala to watch what was happening was an Argentine doctor named Che Guevara. Che Guevara was then expelled and went to Mexico. In Mexico, who did he meet? Fidel Castro, who was there buying that boat, the Granma, that he was going to use to take himself back to Cuba and start the revolution. So Castro was fascinated by the story of what had happened to Arbenz in Guatemala. And Che had been there. So they spent long hours talking about it. And Che's final conclusion was this. This is what he told Castro. Arbenz fell because he tried to impose a social reform project within the framework of democracy. That doesn't work. The CIA will never allow you to do that. The Americans will crush you. Therefore, if we take power in Cuba, it's essential that we purge the army, allow no independent organizations, no student groups, no independent unions, no lawyers organizations, nothing. Everything has to be controlled by the government. It has to be a dictatorship. Otherwise, the Americans will come in and overthrow you. That's the template that not only Castro, but many others who followed Castro took away from what we did in Guatemala. we taught them that you have to have a brutal dictatorship if you want to have social reform in Latin America. That was the lesson that reformers took from the Guatemala coup, and that has spread untold hardship throughout Latin America for generations.
Well, just years later after the revolution, within 2 or 3 years, you have the Bay of Pigs. So if they did not have a strong government that purged the priests, everything, if the U.S. would have gone in there.
You're absolutely right. Had Castro behaved like Arbenz, he would have been overthrown very quickly. However, actually, after Castro took power, he even invited Arbenz, the overthrown president of Guatemala, to Cuba. And one time, Arbenz was sitting up on the platform with Castro while Castro was giving a speech. And Castro was warning the Americans in his speech that he's not going to be easily overthrown. And he used the phrase, Cuba no es Guatemala, meaning we're not so stupid like this guy sitting next to me. And Arbenz really didn't like that. He finally left Cuba. He couldn't put up with it. But Che Guevara used to say this a lot. We are not Guatemala. It means we're not stupid enough to have a democracy, because we know that if we have a democracy, we'll be overthrown. So we have to have a dictatorship. You're going to yell at us, but it's the only way we can impose our project.
Well, then let's go to Chile. I mean, Allende went the Guatemala way rather than the Cuba way. And so you saw what happened.
I think in a way, the Arbenz coup of 1954 and the Allende coup of 1973, although they were separated by 20 years, had one very important motivation in common. It was very important to the United States government that leftist or nationalist regimes or governments that were not in line with the United States in foreign policy should not be allowed to succeed. Even in places like Indonesia, where we failed to overthrow the leader, in that case, Sukarno, we still thought it was a success because we had made sure that he wouldn't be able to succeed. We have tapes from Nixon in which he specifically says this about Allende. The image cannot be projected that it's possible to do this and succeed. So I think that is a commonality that runs through our interventions, not only in Latin America, but beyond. We always wanted to be sure that even if we couldn't overthrow a government that we didn't like, we should make it miserable for that government and send out the message to the world that if you don't support the United States, your people are going to suffer. This has been an intimate part of American foreign policy, and it's something that has caused a lot of resentment for reasons that are easy to understand.
Okay, so now we go 5-6 years after Allende, you got the Sandinista revolution. And what path did they take that was similar to Arbenz and what was similar to Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Cuba?
The Sandinistas in the 1980s were really kind of inventing it as they went along. They wanted to be Castro-type socialists. On the other hand, they had a large private sector already developed. They had to constantly try to make that balance. In the meantime, they had to face this American war, which made it very difficult for them to tolerate dissent. In those days, as now, the United States was the principal supporter of dissent in Nicaragua. It's a little bit like what's happening there now, that the U.S., or what's happening in Cuba, that dissent is legitimate, but it's also totally subsidized by the United States. So that casts a shadow over its authenticity. The Sandinistas made a lot of terrible mistakes, as many of their then leaders will now admit. On the other hand, they were under pressure from the United States that was not just political, but military. I mean, they had 40,000 Nicaraguans killed in that war. That's a country that had the population of Massachusetts. Imagine that happening in Massachusetts. So we can't imagine how the Sandinista government of the 1980s might have unfolded if it didn't have to face a war. But the fact is, its efforts were crushed before they could flower. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? People are still arguing about it, but there's no doubt that Reagan had a fixation on the Sandinistas. He was obsessed with them. I was living in Nicaragua during the time that you visited in the 1980s. And Reagan was talking about the Sandinistas as essentially the greatest threat to human freedom that now existed in the world. When I had visitors, I used to take them around Managua, and I'd take them past these big mud fields where people had erected shacks made out of cardboard and tin with poles holding the flaps together. And I'd stop and say, take a look at that. That's the threat. You heard from Reagan, Nicaragua is a threat to us. That's the threat. Those people living in the mud over there. So it was a little bit like Guatemala or Grenada. We're building these places up as if they threaten the United States of America. Reagan was saying that Nicaragua was only a certain number of hours away from Harlingen, Texas. They could come and invade us at any time. So it's a great twisting of the world reality to say that the United States is this poor little country that's being attacked all the time by Cuba, by Guatemala, by Grenada, by Nicaragua. The rest of the world doesn't see us quite that way. And it shows you how distorted your self-image can become when you only look in the mirror.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, one of the fascinations, the way that Spain stood up against fascism, and they were totally blown off by European countries like France and England. And then you got Nicaragua in the 80s, they were kind of spurned by other, I think only Sweden kind of supported them. But now it has morphed from that period of time to where we are right now with Ortega in power. Obviously, he's anti-US, although they get IMF loans, and Charlie Castaldi told me that the economy's in pretty good shape, whatever that means there. I know they're not getting any tourism right now, but what is it that Ortega wants? If he doesn't want internal dissent, he doesn't want the U.S. What is it? What is his point? What other than personal power? What is it that he wants?
Well, I think that's the key question, and I don't think there is anything other than personal power. It takes me back to one of my own observations after many years of watching governments as a foreign correspondent, and it's this: I'm not against dictators in principle. I don't really care. I like it if you come to power legally, but if you don't come to power legally, yeah, that's okay. I can live with that. I like it if you allow dissent, but if you don't, that's not a deal breaker for me. What I want to know is, what's the government doing for the people in the country? Is there a process underway? Are more people getting electricity? Are more people getting education? Is the healthcare system growing? That's something that's important. Democracy is, you can't eat it. It's nothing that you can feel. It's a reason people like democracy is not for democracy itself, but because it's a way to get things that really are good, like freedom and food and healthcare. But if other systems produce that, that's okay with me. But Ortega's system is not doing that. It's not only undemocratic, but there's no process going on in Nicaragua. It's still the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. Ortega has been in power for 16 years. He has to bear some responsibility for that. There is no hope of Nicaragua emerging from that situation under this regime. So no, there is no goal other than staying in power. And that's what I don't like about it. If Ortega's goal was staying in power forever and dramatically improving the standard of living of Nicaraguans, I could be more sympathetic, but that's not happening.
All right. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you about, I criticized Nicaragua before this, we started talking off the air. I was saying that I get attacked by people for criticizing Nicaragua. I was there. I saw what was possible. I had a lot of hope. Criticizing Ortega right now is not criticizing Sandinistas. It's just criticizing a person in power. There are those who gloss over all of the things that you just pointed out earlier about the 300 students that were shot at UCA and locking everybody up, not tolerating dissent. And these guys are journalists. They wouldn't be able to operate freely in Nicaragua right now. What is your response to that? You got 2 minutes here.
It's an uncomfortable position to be on the side of Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio denouncing Daniel Ortega. It's not comfortable for me, and I know it's not comfortable for
Elliot Abrams. I mean, I'm criticizing it, but I don't want what Elliot Abrams wants.
And I also feel that the Nicaraguan opposition has made a mistake in tying the sanctions of the United States and the anti-Nicaragua efforts by the United States to the efforts against Venezuela and against Cuba. I still think it's quite possible to hate the sanctions on Cuba and hate the sanctions on Venezuela and still be very anti-Ortega.
Right.
So I feel that there's a certain nostalgia, Elijah, for maybe for people that weren't there then. But it's really distressing for me to see people feeling that they have to support this brutal regime because they've bought some of its superficial propaganda. I get it. I understand it. Several hundred of the leftist supporters of the Sandinistas published a very anguished letter recently about why they're opposed to Ortega. And it's clear in the letter, it took them a lot to get to that point because they understand the roots of the Sandinista revolution. But this government has pulled that tree up by the roots. And there's nothing left of Sandinista idealism and ambition in the Ortega regime. So despite the unpleasant company one finds oneself in being critical of Ortega, I think that's still the moral and politically reasonable position.
Well, I'm not going to follow that. That was a perfect note to end with. That was Jelly Roll Morton coda. And
love it. Maybe you could say Carlos Mejia Godoy.
All right, we're gonna go out with another Carlos Mejia Godoy. We've been talking to Stephen Kinzer. How do people reach you? At Stephen Kinzer at Twitter, at Stephen Kinzer. Quickly, how do people, stay in contact?
So I have a website. It's stephenkinzer.com, and you can see all my newspaper columns and all my rants on there. And who knows, there might even be a video of this very interview posted up there quite soon.
Listen, we're going to get a lot of heat from one side or the other. Trust me on this one.
We're both used to it.
Stephen Kinzer, I got to be honest. I got to call him as I see him. So, I'm not going to play around. Thank you very much. And continued success. You keep pumping it out, like Joseph Conrad. There's a book every week. All right. See you later, Stephen.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Vendrá la guerra, amor, y en el combate no habrá tregua ni freno para el canto, sino poesía haciendo incontenible del cañón de fusiles libertarios. Vendrá la guerra, amor, y en el combate nos fundiremos en las barricadas, deteniendo las hordas criminales, a punta de corazón, fuego y metralla, cavando sudorosos el futuro en las faldas de la mar. Aquí están los cachorros de Sardina.
Los venceremos, amor, no pasará. Si mañana que irrumpa el nuevo día, con su fiesta de pájaros y niños, aunque no estemos juntos, te lo juro, no pasará. Los venceremos, amor, no pasará. Si mañana que irrumpa el nuevo día, con su fiesta de pájaros y niños, aunque no estemos juntos, te lo juro, no pasará. vendrá la guerra, amor. Yo me envolveré en tu sombra invencible. Como un fiero león, protegeré esta tierra y mis cachorros. Nadie detendrá esta victoria, armada de futuro hasta los dientes. Que truene hasta la frontera. ¡Luchamos para vencer!
Los venceremos, amor, no pasará. Si mañana que rompa el nuevo día, su fiesta de pájaros y niños, aunque no estemos juntos, te lo juro, no pasará.
¡Eso, puño!
Si mañana que rompa el nuevo día, por su fiesta de pájaros y niños, aunque no estemos juntos,